Richard was very kind in pointing out some of the things that Longitude has partnered with the club on, but I'm going to suggest that we actually take a quantum step backwards. And I have one word for you from 40 years ago, actually 42 years ago to be precise, and that, if this works, is Pong. Who remembers Pong? Anyone? Pong? Anyone? I was very excited about it as a kid, and I'm going to emphasize that I was a small child. I don't want to overly date myself. But Pong was the beginning of something staggeringly exciting. It was the beginning of the video game era. It was the beginning of the end, or at least the ushering over to the collector's world of those electromechanical pinball machines that used to define arcades. Pong, I'm going to use as a marker for something much larger, for the march of technology. It's a bizarre topic to bring up at the Asian Racing Conference, but what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes arguing that there's been convergence and that there's opportunity and relevance for racing. Let's look at the convergence between video, the financial markets, and racing, and specifically wagering. So let's look at those three different worlds, and let's look at the fact, in fact, I will suggest that ultimately the underpinnings of the financial markets and what's been enabled using technology directly converge with racing, and that the underpinnings of wagering and the underpinnings of the markets, and specifically the derivatives markets, are connected. They share a common DNA. So let's start with Pong. It was very exciting. It came out as an arcade game. It was the arcade game for a brief period. A couple years later, it came out as a home console, a must-have. I desperately wanted one. And then it was obsolete. Obsolescence marked by the time that my brother and I finally got one as a present, but we'll skip that. What came after Pong? And again, let's look at these as markers. Let's look at the progression in video without statistics, without how many computations per second are there or how many processors are involved. And let's look at the march that you can see. Pac-Man. Who was a Pac-Man fan? I practically broke my wrist playing Pac-Man. And then the processing power got a little bit better. The programmers pushed the envelope a little, and we got Ms. Pac-Man, a little better game. Fast forward a bit more, and the technology, the march, the underpinnings of all of it have continued to progress, specifically the processing power and the ability to build complex images. Those images, at the end of the day, are exercises in mathematics. Let's fast forward a generation, and let's see what my two sons get excited about. It's a game called GT6. For those of you that are not Gran Turismo 6 aficionados, it's a racing simulation. This happens to be at Le Mans. I can tell you that I finally actually got to go to Le Mans with my oldest son last summer, and it was like I'd already been there. It was like I'd been there again and again and again. Oh, this is the corner where Charlie crashes every time he pushes the envelope a little too fast. But forget the anecdote and look at what it represents in terms of processing power. This isn't a particularly good video clip. I confess it would have caused a family altercation if I'd lifted the PlayStation and said, I'm taking it to the conference, boys. Forget about it. It's gone. I need it for work. This is just lifted from YouTube. People post thousands and thousands of clips of their racing exploits on GT6, on YouTube. But the reality and the reflections, look at the reflections of those images, the reflections of the helmet in the background, that the shadows are perfect. It's a virtual reality. It's a virtual reality that exists on a modern video card. And that video card represents a staggering amount of processing power. In fact, there's processing power on a modern graphics card that would go head-to-head with what used to be considered a supercomputer. And the supercomputers that are used today in a host of industries that are very computationally intensive, are frequently populated not by the CPUs that most of us think of as the brain of a computer, but rather by graphics cards. So let's look at the application, at the march of technology that's represented in the march from Pong to GT6, or whatever the household video game of choice is. Look at the processing power on the phone in all of our pockets. Let's look at what's happened in terms of that march, and let's go through to see what happened in the financial markets. I came from this world. I used to be a pit trader, a floor trader, and this was how markets were transacted. You can go back to the age of the Dutch tulip trading, and there was open outcry. There have been markets through time immemorial. But what's happened with the application of computing power has been transformative. The yelling and screaming, the fact that, I don't know who this is, but let's quickly skip, I was one of them, that has moved, and it's moved dramatically. So let's look during that same time period that started with Pong, and let's use derivatives markets, because I think this is a very, very important beginning, the foundation of the connection to wagering, to racing. Let's go back to 1973, so the spring following Pong's debut, and the launch of exchange-traded standardized options on stocks in the US. This started at a place called the Chicago Board Options Exchange. That video that I showed you a second ago was actually taken from the floor of the CBOE. Here's the pits in the 70s, founded in 73. Not exactly an orderly market, but a market and readily recognizable to anyone that deals in markets. We all look at markets, we all see them, we're intimately familiar with them. We're familiar with the volatility, the rate at which things change. Technology edged its way in, and what was considered acceptable in 1970, it's moved, and it's moved very, very significantly. But there was a bit of a big bang, if you will, when that image that I showed you, that video, this disorderly world transformed to this. In 2000, a company called ISE launched what I would argue was the big bang of derivatives trading in the United States. ISE happens to be Longitude's parent, and let's start to more tightly couple securities market derivatives trading with wagering. The launch of ISE was defined by, first and foremost, the beginning, in fact, the first trading of markets, of options markets, stock options markets in the United States entirely on a computer. These server racks, those were the first of ISE. That was the trading floor. Instead of having an order that was phoned to the floor, that was run out by a runner in a colorful jacket and handed to someone on the edge of the mayhem zone where it'd get represented, and hopefully a minute later, or maybe on a busy day, many, many minutes later, you'd get a fill back. Suddenly, it was possible to capture every bid and every offer from retail trader and professional alike, and simultaneously represent them, disseminate them to the world, and enter into a world of faster and cheaper, better execution, and extending these advantages to a whole host of different dynamics in the securities markets, embracing technology and exploiting it. There are a couple of attributes that I'll suggest to you are worth taking note of. When you stand back and say, what's in this for me? Terrific, we got to talk about Pong and Pac-Man. Wait a minute, what's in it for me? What's in it for racing? Well, there are some hallmarks that you hear about when we have discussions like this that I would suggest to you are really very important. They're fundamental to a vibrant market. Transparency. The ability to always see a price, what's it worth. That's hugely important. Richard pointing out that now the Jockey Club's customers can go and they can use Racing Touch and put in their horses, their choice, and see what the odds are in real time. That's transformative. That matters. That's profoundly important to markets. And that demands the immediate exploitation of the technology that has evolved, that's now available. Product innovation, not just transparency and continuous updates, live, real-time updates, but product innovation where suddenly, whether it's the composite win or a new way to do something with a 4 or 5 place bet, exploiting technology to be able to deliver that is hugely important. The march of the securities markets from the pits, and some of the pits still exist and they have a place, but to purely electronic markets that exploit the march of technology, that's allowed an explosion in the number of products supported. Those numbers, that transformation, are really very compelling. If we start with that freeze frame of those servers, the Big Bang and the creation of a purely electronic market in United States options trading, 2000. On a typical day, the US securities markets across the exchanges trading at the time, 5 with the launch of ISE, there would be about 2 million options contracts traded, 2 million. Let's fast forward. Let's fast forward not quite 15 years, a financial crisis or 2, and a wildly different market with staggeringly improved technology. Today, the markets that trade, and there are now actually 12 options exchanges in the United States, in aggregate, they trade 18 million contracts a day, a 9-fold increase that's been powered by technology. The kind of access that Richard was talking about making available to Jockey Club customers, that kind of access has become central to the health of securities markets globally. The markets that have advanced the most quickly have been the most responsive to customers. They have embraced the technology and they've made it available. It's a direct benefit of the computing power that's evolved. And there's another piece to the puzzle, and that's looking at how you actually value things. Those simple-looking servers from 2000, they were actually assembled in '99, to this hallway that's sitting in a many hundreds of thousands of square feet data center in New Jersey. These are the servers that ISE runs on today. It's not as sexy as a trading floor, but you don't hang out on the trading floor. Your customer experience is not on the trading floor. It's in how you engage with the market. And the technology there has been compelling. If you look at derivatives markets, and again, there's an immediate connection with wagering. ISE, and I'll use it as a surrogate for the larger market, will typically offer options trading on between 2,500 and 3,000 individual stocks. And the options, those rates to buy or to sell a stock in a defined period, those options, well, there'll be about 100 of them on a stock. So it's not unusual to see 250,000, 300,000 different tradable instruments that are continuously being updated. What does that mean in terms of data? What does that mean in terms of computational power? Well, on average, we hover around 1 million messages per second, 1 million price dates up per second as the markets fly around. Each one of those tradable. Those are things that customers can actually see. Professionals and retail customers alike have become not just accustomed to, but they demand being able to see the numbers and what those numbers mean, what things are worth. I think I have another piece here. That's hugely important, and now we're going to start to see some real convergence. All the numbers, and this is a brutal vision test. I don't expect to be able to read it from here, looking at the monitor in front of me. If any of you can read it there, even on the large screens, more power to you. But what's scrolling away here was actually captured on the U.S. market open a couple of days ago before I got on the plane from New York. This is the opening of all of the options on Apple, and this one's Facebook. And the columns in the middle of the screen, those are what are referred to as theoretical values. The same way that the very sophisticated punters in Hong Kong, in fact, if you go from the casual punters, and Richard and Winfried yesterday talked about segmentation and realizing that the market that is wagering is different things to different people. As you get to the more sophisticated and then the very sophisticated, they run complex equations on what these things are worth. In fact, there was a Nobel Prize awarded for a model called the Black-Scholes model to come up with what things are worth. Those middle columns are applying a calculus equation, a theoretical value equation, to come up with what options traders refer to as the Greeks. And they are the theoretical value of a given contract and a whole host of things about rate of change. What's important here is that you have all of these things streaming away, 1 million messages a second, all of this change, quick, 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 quick. And people want to figure out what they're worth. Well, figuring out what they're worth using a calculus equation, whether it's a Black-Scholes or some descendant thereof, is incredibly demanding computationally. In fact, traders will refer to the pricing models as surfaces. They'll refer to them as volatility surfaces. Go back to that race car at Le Mans and the surface, picturing that, creating that image, that graphical image, which is not a photograph. It's reassembled using data on a graphics card. This, what's scrolling in front of you, as meaningless as it is in that small font, that's being run on a graphics card. In fact, if we start to bring things together and look at this event, and I will argue that racing has a staggering head start on the entirety of the financial markets, because no matter who your favorite financial commentator is, whether you want to watch CNBC or Fox or Bloomberg or whatever your financial news network of choice is, there is nothing that is as compelling as this sport. It is magnificent. It's beautiful. It's also an event market. The outcome, options, and here's a hard, fast connection. What something is worth at the end, that contract, that way that people express their opinion in a bet, that actually is directly connected to the securities markets. And let's specifically look at options, because the fact of the matter is where a stock closes tonight, or where it closes at the end of the week, or at the end of the month, or at the end of the year, that's an event. You can have a contract on that, an options contract. Where a race finishes, where that race finishes in terms of first, or whether there's a place or a show, well, that is an event. It's a far more beautiful underlying event, but it's an event market. And the parimutuel methodology, and let's go back to this tote wagon, let's go a full century before options started trading in an organized fashion on stocks in the US. In this case, almost exactly 110 years. The parimutuel model is as elegant a solution as ever to arrive at what something's worth, a market-driven valuation. Fast forward a bit to 1919, or 1913 rather, and the automated totalizator. That is a calculation. It was an enhancement to parimutuel wagering, but it is still an event market. Now let's fast forward to what Richard was talking about. Let's look at what we've done with graphics cards and longitude. And these are really just a delivery vehicle. I keep mentioning graphics cards, but again, it's a surrogate for what's happened in computational power. What Richard was referring to with the composite win, what we actually first had the enormous privilege of introducing to those of you that were in Istanbul 2 years ago, that was an exercise in some ways in the theoretical. We had a demo. We were very excited about it. We were really thrilled to get to share it with you. But it's far, far greater an honor to actually have been invited here. We're very appreciative of the Jockey Club, not just inviting us, but most of all, actually launching Longitude. So let's revisit what we first discussed 2 years ago and what's evolved. Most importantly, what's live in the Hong Kong Jockey Club data centers today? What's live when you go to the track this evening, when you go to Happy Valley? Pay attention to the 5th race. What I have up here now is a screenshot. It was fun to demo. We're perfectly happy to share with you how the system works and spend time today. But it's much better to see what the Jockey Club has actually implemented. It's now applied, it's real, and it's live. And it's where this convergence comes together. Because that calculation that Richard talked about, the composite win, or this evening, today, the quartet, that's actually being calculated on an NVIDIA graphics card. It's the same graphics card that was running those theoretical values for options in New York last week. It's actually the same model. Those graphics cards that were driving GT6 that puts the smile and sometimes the screams of frustration on my kids, running on a graphics card. That quantum leap in processing power, that march from Pong to GT6 to financial markets to wagering, it's convergence. So whether you look at what Richard described, we're taking the money and parsing it very carefully between different win scenarios so the punter can invent their own bet. The idea that a punter actually, taken to extreme, doesn't have to know what they're betting on. They just have an opinion. They think this one's going to finish first. They don't have to know what that's called. They think these four horses are going to be the first 4, maybe in order, maybe not in order. Well, they don't need to know what that's called. What's going on in the background, very quickly to wrap up. And this applies to a single race. This applies to multiple races offered as an event where people can choose what it is that they're interested in. What is it that's coming together? What is it that's reflected in the quartet? Those compelling numbers. 80,548, pretty nice on $10. That would get my attention. I think that's compelling. What the graphics cards are doing, what that equation where finance meets graphics meets wagering is doing, is it's deconstructing an event. And this wasn't even possible a decade ago. The processing power wasn't there. In fact, when Longitude was first invented, it was first conceived for financial markets, for illiquid assets. The very first auction on a financial event, on an illiquid financial asset run as a test market, to converge all the prices, to deconstruct them into their tiny little pieces, deconstructing an event into every possible outcome, and then looking at the outcome that you want. In the case of a punter, you don't even have to know what it's called. And putting the pieces together in the perfect proportion that Richard described with the composite win. The graphics card is doing that again and again and again, and coming up with the odds perfectly balanced. And it's doing it in a fractional second. 10 years ago, the computing power that was available, it took about a day. That's the convergence. So whether you're looking at financial markets or the market that has all of us here today wagering on racing, the spectacle that is racing, you have event markets, and now you have technology that actually lets you express it in a different way. The only limit to what you can do as operators or to what your punters, your customers can do is their imagination, because you can quite literally deconstruct using the technology that's available now, using what's happened with processing power, and allow people to define their own futures. That's staggeringly empowering. That's very exciting. So we're thrilled to have partnered with the Jockey Club to actually begin to deploy that. I would challenge all of you to look at what you're doing with your racing and see what you want to offer to your customers. There's an opportunity here to embrace technology that can be, I would argue, shamelessly borrowed from the parallel markets of video, of processing power, and of financial markets. It's a thrill to actually see it. I would strongly encourage you to bet the quartet this evening, early and often. As everyone said yesterday, the Jockey Club's a charity, so please contribute to this very fine charity. Bet the quartet and see what it looks like to actually get real-time odds, and then stretch your imagination to some of the things that Richard described as coming in the very near future, where you're able to exploit that deconstruction event into its elements and reconstruct it in your own image and what the punters want and what your customers want. Thank you.